packed activity, so I'm going to get in as much as I can and make it as fun and interactive as possible. Sound good?
Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. Nobody else was engaged. So B.O.U.N.C.E is actually an acronym for 6 different steps on how to bounce back from setbacks. The first step, B, is a sense of belief. O is optimism. U is understanding self. N is nurturing connection. C is compassion. And E is esteem or efficacy. So I just want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about how B.O.U.N.C.E came to be. Really, I'm most passionate about resiliency, which is kind of a hot topic right now. But I actually started studying resiliency about 25 years ago. It used to be called hardiness. It wasn't even resiliency. And I was most interested in why you could have certain people that seem to have a lot of adverse circumstances, and they just seem to overcome. You could even have 2 siblings in the same family, similar upbringing, and then you had one that seemed to overcome and the other one that didn't. And so back in my 20s, I was fascinated with, if you could identify what created the traits on how to be resilient, then we could actually teach people on how to be resilient. And what's most interesting is, has anybody ever heard of the ACEs study? Yeah? So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And with the ACEs study, there's about 10 different topics that they look at. There's various assessments. There's like an abbreviated version, and then there's a longer version. But they basically look at things like, in the household up until the time that you were 18, did you experience physical abuse, any type of violence, weapons? Did you experience sexual abuse? Did you experience drug abuse? Was there prison and incarceration? Was there a sense of neglect where there wasn't any food or stable shelter? Those are all the topics. And if you actually Google ACEs study, you'll see different variations of how to take that assessment. What's fascinating about this is your ACEs score is now correlated with how long you live. And the reason is, when you look at those adverse circumstances as a child, people make different decisions. And what they found is it's actually related to health behaviors. So the higher the ACEs score, meaning the more trauma that one has actually experienced, the more likelihood they engage in all kinds of different behaviors, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, smoking. They have depression. It's related to unbelievable elements in terms of cancer, heart disease. It's like 10 times the amount more likely. And that's because of that background. People make different decisions. And of course, we know now that stress actually impacts us physiologically. My ACEs score, there's an abbreviated one that I did that was a 10. My ACEs score is 9. So there's one I didn't have in my actual childhood, which is why I'm incredibly passionate about this topic, because I truly believe that everybody has the capacity to overcome and to be resilient. We just need to know that we actually have the choice. And so I've literally been studying this and focused on this for the last 25 years. And I went back to school about 4 years ago to get my doctorate in human behavior. And my dissertation is actually on resiliency. Because we could teach people to actually be resilient, then even if we experience trauma, we have the ability to actually overcome. And to me, that's completely related to health and wellness. These are a couple of my most favorite quotes. This one's interesting. Keep your face to the sunshine, and you cannot see a shadow. From Helen Keller. That's pretty intuitive to me. So in all the research on resiliency, one of the things that we found is most of the research originally looked at what makes somebody resilient, like what are their traits. And they found certain things like people who are optimistic, people who tend to be more intelligent, people who have a sense of faith and spirituality. Those are all internal traits. But then they started looking at, well, what's the process? How do you actually cultivate resiliency? And so that's where the research headed over the last little while. And then they started looking at intervention programs, a lot of programs that they do now in the school systems so that they can help kids be more resilient. But the most recent phase is the multi-level phase, which is you can't really be resilient without considering what the context is and what the environment is. So you can be an individually resilient person, You can also have a resilient family. You could have a resilient neighborhood. You could have a resilient community. And those factors and how they actually interact are vastly different. So if we look at workplace stressors, these are going to be familiar to a lot of you. These are the people that stress us out beyond belief. These are the people that I deal with on a continual basis to try to help. I call them volcano people who just explode with anger and frustration. You've got people who blame all the time. You're manipulative people. I was just talking to a client the other day, and she was telling me about this guy, and he had said something that just totally threw me under the bus. And I was very perplexed by that. And she goes, well, he's a pot stirrer. And so I was like, why do people instigate when they do that? Because it takes the pressure off them, or they feel like they have a sense of control because now they can see other people reacting. That leads to a toxic work environment as well. Ironically, he's the person that hired me to fix it. There's gossiping, which is incredibly toxic. The victim, you guys know what the victim is? The victim is the one who goes, they complain, and then when you offer a solution, they go, no, that'll never work. I tried that. Why bother? So they're not actually antagonizing anybody, but they actually create negative energy as well. And then that's part of the helplessness as well. So when we talk about workplace wellness, and we talk about resiliency in context, we can build resiliency, but we have to be aware of what is the context and what's the environment in which somebody's functioning. You can be incredibly resilient, but if you're in this environment all the time, it's going to end up having an impact on you. And the impact actually is a high level of confusion, a high level of conflict, negativity, exhaustion, lack of focus, insecurity, isolation, and then, of course, physical ailments. It's amazing to me when you are in a toxic environment where there's a ton of drama, how people perceive kind of neutral events very negatively because there's no trust there. And that obviously has an impact on us in terms of stress. And that's why it's really important that when you look at overall workplace wellness, you're not just looking at one component. If we look at just physical health and physical well-being, but we don't look at the mindset or we don't look at the social elements, then we're actually missing a piece. And what's beautiful about this model in terms of workplace wellness is it perfectly suits the multi-level research that's being done on resiliency, because all of these components impact it. We all know that if there's financial strain, that's going to impact everything else. So as we look at workplace wellness, I'm focused predominantly today on mindset. I work with a team of people that offer all of these because I think they're all really, really important. But I'm focusing predominantly on mindset today, just so you kind of have the context. Here's how to listen to me talk today. So you can look at it I call it live it, give it, and then drive it. Live it is how do you yourself become personally resilient? So based off the activities that we do today, you'll have an opportunity to learn some things about yourself and how you can become more resilient. Give it is you want to be able to teach other people how to be resilient. You want to have interactions and conversations with them that actually inspire them to be resilient. And then drive it is how do you drive it home? If you're talking about workplace wellness, then if one person is resilient, we want to get to the point where that becomes contagious, that goes all the way through. Not only that, but you want to look at the workers. And are the workers able to bring that information home to the family so that they can actually produce family resiliency? That's where you get the sustainability factors when you start impacting the systems and not just one level. So B.O.U.N.C.E again, sense of belief, optimism, understanding self, nurturing connections, compassion, and esteem. So first one is belief. In front of you, you kind of have a brief overview of B.O.U.N.C.E that you can take notes on. There's one that Steve handed out nicely, and then there's a little bit more colorful one that will match the slides today. There are more than 60 slides, so if you actually want to copy the slide deck, just leave me your business card and I'll be happy to send them out to you. Behind this one, you'll find that there's a bounce back survey. And because we got started a little late today, I'm just going to show this to you guys and then have you take it on your free time. It's not scientific, but it'll just give you an overview of what are some of the components of resiliency and whether or not you're able to bounce back. And so basically you're just scoring it on true, usually true, all the way to not true. So the first one is belief. Belief for me is about having a much bigger perspective on your life. Has anybody ever gone to the Grand Canyon? Have you ever tried to take a picture of the Grand Canyon? What happens? It doesn't capture it. But in those moments when we get how something is so vast, it's almost like looking out over into the ocean, that we get that we're just one piece in that, and it gives us a very broad perspective. Part of that perspective is what is our actual purpose in life. And if we can see how we make a difference into the bigger perspective, it enhances our engagement and enhances our fulfillment. A lot of times, there's one woman I worked with one time who was an executive assistant, and she kept saying, "I'm just an executive assistant." But she was working in a nonprofit who was actually doing research and protecting homes against major disasters. So she didn't understand that she was supporting the CEO to make sure that in the end they built homes that saved lives. Totally missed that perspective. In her mind, she was just an assistant. If we gain a much broader perspective, that actually helps with resiliency, because then we don't just see what we're doing, but we see it in the context of what's really important. Identifying your purpose is a major question, existential question that people may spend years trying to figure out and discover. I have found that the easiest way to identify your purpose is to take a look at your personality, your core values, and your strengths. And where those intersect is going to give you what I call your God-given talent, and you need to be using that on a daily basis. Whether or not you can articulate your purpose is irrelevant. It's whether you feel like you're doing something meaningful that makes the big difference. So one of the activities we're going to do is called childhood dreams. There's a couple questions here. I want you guys to work with each other inside your tables. The first question is, remember as a childhood fantasy you had as a kid. One of the things I used to do as a kid, you know, at like 7-Eleven, I don't know if they still do them for the lotto, but you know how they used to have those tickets where you would bubble in the numbers? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do they still have those? Where you bubble in the number? Yeah. So I used to grab a stack of them, and I used to sit in my room, and I used to line up my stuffed animals. And I used to teach them, and those were their tests. And I had a brother, but I opted to teach my stuffed animals. That gives you a clue as to why I'm standing here now, right? If we go back to what we were like when we were kids, we'll gain a lot of insight into what we were naturally drawn towards before our mind got in the way and told ourselves, no, I can't do that. So think, what did you think you were going to be when you were a kid? What did you aspire to do? Think back, what did you want to be when you grew up? Have any of these dreams persisted? Sometimes we have that little voice in our head that kind of nags us, and then we push it away and we say, yeah, no, that's never going to happen. But we actually want to listen to that. If the dreams have changed, are there underlying or unifying themes among them? So one of my themes was teaching. So I used to teach my stuffed animals. I also used to have this vision. I had a vision of a really big dog. I don't know what that had to do with work, but I actually have a really big dog. And I used to see myself in a conference room. It was like cherry wood. And when I envisioned myself, I was probably like in my 20s. But at that time when I envisioned it, I was probably like 15. But I didn't aspire to be a teacher. But those were just kind of little glimpses of all of the things that I just saw myself doing that I wanted to do. And I listened to them, thankfully. So how might you use that theme? So the theme for me was always facilitating. It didn't mean I was going to become a teacher. It just gave me insight into what is it. How might you use this theme? So for some people, it might be helping others. It might be adventurous, some level of creativity. And then in the end, we'll do a quick debrief. So I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes to kind of think through what are your common themes from when you were a kid, what's something that still persists, and then share it with the rest of your table mates, because the more you share it, the more likely it comes to life. Is there anybody that thought if you thought it was, well, I'm supposed to do nursing, and then you went into that field, you were like, yeah, no, not really right, and so you kind of had to do a pivot? Because I find that maybe about every 7 years, I go through what I want to be when I grow up. And I slightly redefine things and craft it in a new way, but it's ever evolving. Good, thanks for participating, guys. I wanted to mention the new studies that come out in terms of happiness. There's 3 components to happiness, or how we actually define happiness. One of the components is what are called pleasurable activities. So good food, chocolate, sex, all of that kind of stuff is pleasurable activities. That actually is not related to health and happiness. That's very short term. And if you think about happiness in terms of if you go on a roller coaster and you get really excited, sometimes we define happiness as that excitement and that joy. But that's not what's related to long-term happiness and joy and health. The second level is when we're engaged in peak performance. Peak performance, or if you've ever heard flow, is when you're totally in the zone and time just slips away. You're slightly challenged, but not too much. You're just heavily engrossed. That actually has nothing to do with excitement, but it's actually related to long-term health and happiness, because that's when we're using our gifts and our talents to actually make a difference. And the one that's most related to health and happiness is purpose. So when we feel like what we're doing is meaningful and purposeful, that's what's related to long-term health and happiness. And what's unfortunate is how we define happiness is not about that level of excitement or short term. It's the long-term meaning and that broader perspective. So that's why belief is actually related to happiness. Let's look now at optimism. Who here thinks they're an optimist? Who here thinks they're a pessimist? Yeah, we'll see who. Do you think you're a pessimist? Yeah. You're the only one. You go against the grain. People's beliefs of what optimism is and what pessimism is are not always accurate. So when you actually look at optimism, don't believe everything you think. We think we've got it all figured out, and our mind tricks us all the time. And once we realize that we have faulty thinking, we can start looking at things in a slightly different way. Our minds can either be bridges or barriers, depending on how we look at things. And studies have actually shown, has anybody heard of the broaden and build theories? Positive emotions actually expand our ability to problem solve and be creative. And when we're in a negative space, it actually constricts our ability to problem solve. So optimism is not about being Pollyanna and just saying, everything is going to work out. It's actually the ability to problem solve, but a thinking style is actually very different. So when you look at perceptions, when an event occurs, how do you actually interpret that event? A pessimist interprets that event that it's pervasive, it's personal, and it's persistent. And an optimist does the opposite. It's specific, it's based off the environment, and it's temporary. What's really interesting is that's what it looks like if it's a negative event. If it's a positive event, it's actually reversed. So you guys have a couple of cards in your little boxes. Don't eat the strawberries yet. That's a surprise for later on. So there's a yellow index card. Everybody has a slightly different one, and the yellow index card is a really bad negative event that has happened to your table. And then there's a motivator card that is a really good event. And what I want you guys to do is think about how you would be specific, use the environment, and have it be temporary to be an optimist. So one of the ones that's not in there is your dog died. And I'll give you an example of what a pessimist would say. Pervasive would be something like, I feel so sad, I'm always going to feel sad. It doesn't matter what I do in any situation I'm in, this is just how it's going to be forever. That's pervasive. Personal, I'm the only one that's ever going to feel like this. Nobody else understands. It's just totally personal to me. And then persistent, Pervasive is kind of like it erodes everything, and then persistent is forever, and ever and ever. If you've ever gotten into a fight with somebody and they go, "Why you always do that?" That's called globalizing, and it leads to faulty thinking. So the optimist would say, "I'm sad because I lost my dog." Specific. Environment, I'm going to miss seeing my dog every day. And then temporary, I'll get past this. My favorite thing that I say to myself, it's just temporary. It's just temporary. So this is not Pollyanna thinking, right? Pollyanna thinking is, I'm not going to do anything and it will magically work itself out. That's not what true optimism is. True optimism is how we understand a negative event and how we make sense out of it. Now, if you think about it, if you're optimistic and you say it's temporary, I'll get through this, versus, oh my God, it's always going to be like this. Which one gives you motivation? Which one do you think is going to allow you to problem solve? Which one is going to strengthen your relationships with people? So how we change our thoughts influences everything else. So now look at the instance that you have, and then in the table come up with those 3 elements for the negative event. What would be optimistic? I want you guys to actually practice being optimistic. And then I want to see if you guys are honest and if you're all truly optimists or not. All right, does anybody want to share an example, what they had for a negative event? Let's do the cheating spouse. I had the feeling that one might stir up some stuff. This is like almost all women, one male, one male. This is interesting. All right, so what's an optimistic explanatory style for a cheating spouse?
It's not, like, this instance, it's not every man is going to cheat on me or every person is trustworthy.
Right, so if you guys look at specific versus pervasive, pessimistic is all guys are dogs. Specific is this guy, right? And then what's the next one?
That's only temporary. That this moment happening, like,
Right.
I'm trusting part with that person. We go further.
I'll never trust again, yeah. And then what about the environment? That one's a little trickier. The environment is kind of like, now I can no longer trust men, which means I can't trust men at home, I can't trust men at work, I can't trust men at the store, like I just can't trust anywhere. And so it goes into the whole environment. So how many of you were truly optimists? How many of you were like, oh snap, I need to rework some things? Sometimes it depends on the actual event, right? Sometimes things grip us in a different way. But if we're aware of what we're saying to ourselves and we know what we need to be optimistic, this isn't about fooling ourselves. This isn't about saying, oh, it's all going to be fine. It's how we interpret the event, which actually alters then what we do about it. And optimistic people, because they're optimistic, they're more motivated to take action. Pessimistic people become helpless, and then they can't do anything about it. So if you find yourself stuck, it's likely your thought process that's getting in your own way. Good. Oh, we did that. So the next one, U, is understanding self. This is one of my favorite ones. Has anybody ever done the Gallup or Clifton Strengths Finder? Yeah. My favorite tool of all of them. I was actually meeting with a client who was filling out an application to be part of a board. And one of the questions was, what are your unique talents? And I was like, let's pull up your Strengths Finder. You look at it right there. Personality. Remember, when we talk about purpose, if you know what your strengths are, you know what your core values are, you know what your personality is, that starts to give you a unifying theme. The other component about understanding yourself is how do you actually manage emotions? How do you identify what you're feeling? How do you even identify what's triggering you? You know what a hot button is? What's a hot button?
Standing behind me while I brush my teeth in the morning.
Hot button is like somebody irritates you, it's kind of the difference between a gnat, where something's like annoying you, and then you're like road rage. So a hot button is when you go to 0 to road rage really, really quickly because something happened, but your reaction is far more intense than what's warranted. And that's usually because it's poking at something that's much bigger. And if we don't understand ourselves, then we're volcano man, and we just erupt on people all the time. Before I go into this, you want to do a break?
We have a few minutes. Unless we want to take a break now, it's fine.
Oh, you know what? I had the timing off. I wrote it wrong. You just let me know, okay? We'll keep going. Yeah, we'll go. All right.
10 minutes, we'll do a break.
Okay. This is a good one. I like this one. So managing emotions. We have 4 choices when we're talking about managing our own emotions. We become volcano man, so we just absolutely lose it, and then I wonder why I lost it. Number 2, accept the emotion without trying to regain control. That looks like the person who goes, I'm fine. I'm not going to let it bother me. And they're in total denial, and what they're doing is they're tolerating. There's a very big difference between tolerating and accepting. Tolerating means I'm holding it in, and I'm secretly resentful, but I'm not going to say anything. Accepting means it doesn't bother me. I accept it the way it is. I'm not trying to change it. Tolerating, emotionally, physiologically, very, very bad for your health. Accepting, let it go, is very different. So that's an option. Is just hold it in and pretend like you're fine. Number 3, substitute emotions with distractions and escapes, which is what most of the American society is based on. So that is food, porn, alcohol, drugs, video games, workaholism. All of that is purely just an escape to deal with uncomfortable type emotions. And then you're not really dealing with the underlying emotions. The 4th option is to actually manage it by being aware of what the triggers are. There's only one right answer if you want a healthy response, and that's actually managing the triggers. So we're going to do another fun activity. In your buckets, you guys have some balloons. They're quite hard to actually blow up, so stretch them out a little bit. Whoever has the biggest mouth in the group will be the one to blow up the balloon. So what I want you to do is one person blow up the balloon, and while you're snickering trying to watch that person blow it up, this is actually an activity to see how well you deal with stress. It's not, but I was quite annoyed trying to blow it up yesterday. And then there's markers in there, and I want each person in the group to identify what is something that's currently stressing you out, real life. And then everybody is going to write on the balloon what that stressful event is. So each table will have one balloon with everybody's stressful event written on it, okay? Go ahead. Hey, can I have your guys' attention? So I got a really good question about the difference between acceptance and tolerance, and this actually comes up a lot when I coach my clients. People think that acceptance means condoning. Acceptance is not the same as condoning. So here's the example I usually use. I had a dog who was deaf. Loved dog. So whenever we would go out, people would go and talk to her, and I would go, she's deaf. And they would go, oh, I'm so sorry. And I didn't understand why they said, I'm so sorry, because she didn't care. She was happy. Do you know what I mean? Like, you made it be that there was something wrong. She's content. So if I was tolerating her deafness, I would have wished she weren't deaf. But I accepted she was deaf. I didn't condone it. I didn't wish it. I didn't say I wanted her to be deaf. But I'm not trying to change it. I've accepted that that's the current situation. So acceptance is not the same as condoning. Acceptance is that's the decision, and so I don't have to be emotionally attached to it. Does that help? Good. That comes up a lot. Okay. Everybody, you guys got, bring it up. So volunteer number 1, here's what we're going to do. Take your balloon that you guys had. Is it this one? This one? This one? Okay. Just share some stuff with the group in terms of what's on there. You don't have to get into a lot of detail, but I actually want to share this because some of the things that happens is we get really stressed out and we feel isolated. We feel like nobody else is going through it. And then all of a sudden you start hearing other people and you're like, oh, well, they're stressed out too. And they're a bigger wreck than I am, so I'm doing okay. So what are some of the...
Okay. So one of them is job search.
Yeah.
My ex, our healthcare system's handling of the elderly. My youngest brother.
Yeah, those are some good ones. Do you want to grab another one and read some off that one?
Managing relationship, workload, husband, getting new job.
Okay. Don, you grab the first one. Keep that green one. You guys grab one. Isabel, grab the third one.
This is the first one, though.
Yeah, it's okay if it's different. So in life, when we're managing stress, what tends to get overwhelming is we're managing so many things. So I want you to keep that ball in the air. Hit it and keep it in the air. Okay, and now Dawn, you're going to add the second balloon, and she has to keep both in the air. Not you, just the two. Now Isabel, the third one. 3 balls in the air. Nice job.
That's hard to do.
It's hard to do, right? So what's that experience like for you?
Stressful.
Stressful, right?
Thank you. Yeah, stressful.
So now, Dawn, you get to practice. You're going to start with 1. Isabel, you're going to throw the third one. You're going to throw the second one. Go ahead, get some momentum. Go ahead, Kim. Not even a third one. Right.
She didn't practice juggling last
I know,
night
right?
I did.
Yeah, you practiced last night. So now, Isabel, I want you to throw your ball in the air, your balloon in the air. When you throw your second one, I want you guys to actually help Isabel. Get the third one in the air. What do you guys notice?
Teamwork.
You're having fun.
It looks engaging. It's almost visually enticing, right? Okay, guys. Good job, everybody. Let's give them a round of applause. And you guys come get your cups. I love these mugs, and there's actual Starbucks gift cards in there.
Thank you.
Okay. So what did you guys observe with that interaction in terms of how you can relate it to your own life in terms of managing emotions? Yeah, it wasn't an in-depth. It was pretty straightforward. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about when we come back is nurturing connections. So we're going to take a break. We're going to come back in
10 minutes, 3:15.
All right, thank you all. Stress isn't actually an emotion. We say that as a way to kind of capture a bunch of emotions. But if we say we're stressed and we don't actually identify what the underlying emotion is, then we can't actually resolve it. So one of the best techniques we can use to be resilient is to actually identify what the particular emotions are. So we'll do a little activity. Do you guys know what that one is? That first one? So there are actually 7 basic emotions that we all experience. This is 6. The top left, one of the easiest ones to identify is disgust. So if you imagine picking up like a baby diaper, that's the look that you'll get. What's the bottom left? Yeah, excited, surprised, joy. Top middle? Anger. Anger is kind of easy to recognize because the eyebrows get furrowed. And if you see somebody's bottom teeth, leave. I mean, if you see a dog's bottom teeth, run. That's really, really aggressive. What's the baby? Happy. Top right? Yeah, that's fear. Sometimes people confuse fear with surprise. But if you look at surprise, the eyebrows actually arc. And if you look at fear, they actually pull back. Everything becomes frozen. And then the little boy? Sad. You know how when you look at that, you actually feel sad? So if you're ever talking to somebody and you're just not getting the vibe that they're really sad, they're probably not. Because we are actually wired to feel other people's feelings. So when we look at these emotions, we feel them. We're not always able to identify what they are, but if they're genuine, emotions literally are contagious. Now, this is really important when you look at wellness within the workplace. Because if you're dealing with people who are very negative, I call that splat. They're just throwing that stuff on everybody, not even realizing it because we actually absorb those emotions. So one of the ways to manage the emotions is to actually identify how to label it. You guys have all heard of the amygdala hijack? So in our brain, the back part of our brain is the primitive brain. That's basically what you get when you're looking with animals and dogs. Prefrontal cortex, that's this part here, the front of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for our executive functioning, our rational thinking. The amygdala is responsible for our primitive emotions. So when our amygdala is hijacked, we're experiencing some intense emotion, and all of our resources, our brain, our blood flow, our oxygen is actually going to the amygdala. And what it actually does is shuts off the circulation to the prefrontal cortex, which means we become very dumb. Because our rational thought is off the prefrontal cortex. And so if we get hijacked, and by the way, new studies have shown that when we get hijacked and we get stressed out and the body releases cortisol, it stays in our system for 30 hours. Which means the likelihood that it then gets hijacked again is increased. If it gets hijacked to a certain intensity, it impacts the limbic system. And the limbic system is actually the storage of all memories. So if you ever talk to somebody and they're really frustrated about one situation, and then they start talking about all this stuff in the past, and it's connected, right? They started here and all of a sudden it got triggered all the way. That means it's going to the limbic system. And what they're doing is they're taking that event and connecting it to all the rest of the negative events, not using the executive functioning at all. What's fascinating is if we're experiencing an intense emotion in our amygdala, we can't actually identify what we're feeling because that requires the executive functioning. It requires the prefrontal cortex. So if I show somebody a picture and say, what are you experiencing? Guess what happens? They start using their prefrontal cortex because in order to label the emotion, it requires a different part of their brain. And in that moment, when they label it, they then can gain control over those emotions. So the absolute easiest way to control your emotions is to label it. If you say, I'm stressed, that's not helping. You really have to label what that pure emotion is. So one of my favorite activities is the one you'll see in your handouts. There's a dog and a person. I want to play a little game. So let's imagine, grab a pen or a marker. Markers are kind of fun. I don't know if we have enough. But let's start with anger. If we were going to look at a dog that was angry, and we just had to observe physically what's happening with the dog, what might we see differently with the dog? What would the ears look like? Yeah, pin back. What else would we notice? Teeth? Anything with eyes? Yeah, narrow eyes? What? What does the tail do? It doesn't wag. Where does it go? Straight up. At attention, right? Because it's if any animal, including ourselves, if we're angry, there's a threat response, and so we become hypervigilant. Did you do something with the tight? Yeah.
I don't know if you see with dogs, but his pupils might get larger.
Yeah. The eyes change totally, right? Anything else? What about the fur on the back? That all goes up, right? So if you want, you can just notate all those differences on the dog where you would see it. Top to bottom, those are all the indicators of anger. Now pick a different color, and let's do joy, happiness. What happens with the ears when the dog is happy? Huh? Yeah, they go up, right? What happens to the eyes when they're happy? Wide-eyed. What else? Tail wags. If they're super happy, by the way, the tail wags in a circle. If you've ever seen your dog where it goes around, and that's happy, happy. What else will you notice with happiness with a dog? Bouncy. Yeah. What'd you say? Yeah, tongue will come out. They smile. Yeah, yeah, good. Now let's do fear. What happens with the ears? They go back too, in a slightly different way than anger. What happens to the eyes? They could get kind of startled, right? What happens to the body? They get smaller, right? Because that's fear. What happens to the tail? It goes between the legs. So a reason I start with a dog is it seems to be a lot easier for us to identify the emotions on an animal before we actually have to do it with ourselves. But if we look at ourselves, where do we feel anger? Top to bottom, what's different? I like the people who say, I'm really good at hiding my feelings. Yeah. So you can draw around the stubs for like fists. What else changes when you're angry? Your jaw, right? Gets super tight. Yeah? Shoulders? Do you know why that happens? When we're angry, we're actually preparing our body to fight. And so when we flare our nostrils, it allows us to take in more oxygen. That equips us better to fight. So if you see bottom teeth and flared nostrils, out. What else do you notice? Where do you feel anger in your body? Like in your torso? What does it feel like? It's hard, right?
I mean, honestly, I don't know.
This is very hard. That's why we start with the dog. But I tell you, and I'll tell you what, kids are much better at this than adults. Because we get so accustomed to saying I'm stressed, or just we get busy doing, and we don't actually check in with ourselves. So we lose the ability to connect. So somebody said chest, somebody else said stomach. What does that feel like with anger? A tightness? Does anybody feel a burning? Like it's hot for me. Like that's when they say like red with anger. Some people get like an intensity. So now let's shift gears and do fear. Where do you feel fear? Everything contracts. What does your stomach feel like? Yeah, sometimes it's like twisting, or like butterflies, like jumping. Anybody else? What fear feels like? Goosebumps. That's interesting because you get goosebumps for different reasons, but that's an interesting one. Yeah. Have you ever been driving and like somebody narrowly swerves in front of you and you slam on the brakes, and then you get like those goosebumps? It's almost like pricks. That's like an absolute surge of hormones in preparation for that threat. Yeah, that's a real intense fear. Anything else you notice in terms of fear?
Pounding heart.
Definite pounding heart, even with anger too, right? What happens with your breathing with fear?
Not happening.
Not happening, right? We tighten up. And then, of course, that doesn't help with us using the prefrontal cortex at all. If we go back to the picture of the brain, so what I'm asking you to do is identify how you feel those emotions. As difficult as it is right now, that's actually the easiest of all the strategies you can do to manage yourself. That's the easiest. Even though it's challenging, it's by far the easiest because all you're doing is localizing it and identifying it. And the minute, so if I say to somebody, how's that make you feel or what are you experiencing, I'm able to shift it. And once they're able to shift it, then they're able to problem solve out of it. Otherwise, you end up just getting stuck in those emotions. So if you know where you're feeling it in your body, it gives you another avenue to label it and take care of your body. we don't actually realize the impact of the emotions. They do studies now that show that the emotions actually change the cell structure and even certain genetic components as well. That's how strong, because if you think about all the physiology that's involved, if we're not aware of that, then we're not actually able to control any of that. That makes me laugh because that's a pissed off baby right there. And it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter your socioeconomic status, it doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your race. These emotions are the same for everybody, and they're easy to spot. It's not until we get older that we try to stuff them. So one of the things we can do when we look at the body, which is really interesting, is, so I was working with this woman who, she has an insurance agency, and she found out her receptionist is going part-time. And so she's pissed. But she didn't say she was pissed. She said she was stressed and overwhelmed. Well, I can't help with stressed and overwhelmed if we don't know what the emotion is. Anger is related to the thought of it's unfair. So if she knows she's angry, then she knows that she feels like this is unfair. Everything I did for her up until this point, and now she's going to screw me by leaving. I finally had the team the way I wanted it. That's what's creating the anger. But then when she started thinking about it, she's experienced a lot of loss in her life, and she's very close with her receptionist. And now her receptionist isn't going to be there as often. So then I was like, it's not really anger, it was sadness. And then I said, what does sadness feel like? And I had this conversation with somebody else, and she said, it's like somebody scooped out my insides, and it's hollow. I was like, this was a 21-year-old said that. It was a pretty provocative, gives you, that's a yucky feeling. But when I was talking to my other client, I said, what's the shape of the feeling? What is sadness? What shape is sadness? What color is it? What's the texture? If you can identify that feeling and almost look at it as a different component, we get to detach from it. So the way she ended up describing the sadness, it was very muddied. It was gray. It didn't have a good shape. It was just kind of gooey everywhere. So this is another trick to be able to deal with some of that. I found this, and I actually really liked this. Does anybody ever want those moments where you just really want to calm yourself down? And so I'm all about guided meditation. I'm all about mindfulness, which I'll talk about in a minute. But asking me to set aside 20 or 30 minutes to sit in solitude, never going to happen. But if I can control my thoughts by controlling what I say, that actually can relax me. So my arms and legs are heavy and warm. So I said that to myself last night as I was falling asleep, and it was almost like I was melting into the bed. It was so relaxing. My heartbeat is calm and regular. My breathing is free and easy. My abdomen is warm. I actually sat there with my hand on my stomach. My forehead is cool. My mind is quiet and still. Just even saying it's we can control our thoughts by replacing them with the thoughts we want to use instead of ruminating. Ruminating is, you know what I'm going to say to that person? I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say that, and then we replay it for hours until we have it completely crafted, and then, of course, it never goes according to plan, and we spent all that time stressing out about it. The next one is nurturing social connections. Of all of the research that they've done on resiliency, the number one factor related to longevity and health is social support. I do a lot of research in disaster situations and trauma, and whether or not somebody's experienced a catastrophic hurricane or something like 9/11, the ones who bounce back are the ones who have the supports. What's really unfortunate is it takes time to develop strong relationships. It takes energy. We have to invest in the way that we connect with people. And because we get so busy, we let that fall by the wayside. And yet it is shown to be the number one predictor of longevity and health. Benefits of a social network: it gives us a sense of belonging. It gives us a sense of self-worth. When you can share something with somebody else and they get it, because you know when you have those conversations with yourself, like, I think I'm crazy. I must be crazy, right? Am I the only one that's thinking this way? But then you share it with somebody and they're like, I think that too. And you're like, okay, I might still be crazy, but we're both crazy. So it just creates a bonding and gives you that feeling of security. So the way to expand your network: stay in touch, don't compete. Boy, that's the worst thing you can do for your self-esteem and for your friendships, is to one-up somebody. Do you ever share something that's stressful and they're like, oh, I got you beat. This is what I'm dealing with. They're not really interested in what you're dealing with. They just want to show you that their life is worse. We don't want to compete with people. We also don't want to compare ourselves. We want to respect each other and have acceptance. Be a good listener and show appreciation. Being a good listener is by far the most undervalued skill. And I call it a skill because people aren't typically trained on how to listen. But when you felt like you've really been listened to and you've been heard, it's magical. Do you know that when you connect with somebody and you feel heard, it actually releases oxytocin? You know all that, yeah?
I was going to talk about it.
Were you? Well, you'll give a demonstration on it. So an oxytocin, you guys know, which affectionately is called the cuddle hormone, but oxytocin is what we release after sex that makes us bond with people. So when you're listening to somebody, there's what somebody is saying, and then there's everything else. Their body language, their words, what's important to them, their values, their motives, their assumptions. We can't have our own thoughts going on if we're really going to listen to somebody. Really listening means that we're out of ourselves and we're in the moment in listening to what they said. And part of listening is learning how to actually be mindful of those situations where you're not thinking about what you want to say, you're not thinking about what you need to do or what's happening in the future, but you're totally 100% present with that person. That connection will form a very strong social support. Everything else is just fake. And if you look at social networks and Facebook and how people almost feel like, well, look how much I'm connecting, look how many friends I have. Because it doesn't have that depth of connection and it doesn't release those same chemicals, ironically, it actually makes us feel worse. And we're yearning to feel connected. New studies actually show that a sense of belonging and being part of a group or being part of something is actually more important than physical safety. You know how they used to have the hierarchy, like you have to have shelter and food? Belonging now is shown to be more important than housing.
I want you to feel what connection feels like. And to feel that, you have to feel oxytocin. It's a very easy way to feel oxytocin. You're going to give each other a 3-second hug. So turn to your partner, 3-second hug, 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. Any more than 3 seconds, it gets creepy. What do you notice about each other?
You like each other more, no? Yeah.
You're all smiling. You're all feeling connected. And that's the reason that we do anything in life, to feel that connection. Now, go ahead and give yourselves about 2 feet of space. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do a self-massage. A lot of times we're so enthralled with the lifestyle here in America, and we get addicted to all the entertaining things outside. We don't listen. We're not connected with ourselves inside. So we're going to create some oxytocin inside. We're going to do the art of self-massage. So you'll probably want to get a little bit further apart too. Okay, so take your hands, nice loose hands, take your fingertips, and you're going to start to tap on your forehead. Okay, go down into your jaw, open your jaw, relax your jaw. You can make noise. Okay, up to the top of your head, down the back of your neck. Okay, over to your chest, little fist. You're going to go clockwise around the abdomen. That's the way digestion goes. Okay, now take one fist, your right fist, hold your left arm straight out, and you're going to go 3 times down the left arm. All in different locations. 3 times down the right. Shake your hands out. Good. Okay, take those fists, and you gotta do the backside. You gotta do your hips. Do your butt.
You could do that. I would not do that.
Okay? Now, down the right leg. 3 times. Left leg. Stomp your feet. Let them know you're here. There you go. Everybody just got a full body massage. You're very welcome.
What does that do, Chris?
So it's going to increase your circulation. It's going to increase all your feel-good hormones, dopamine, oxytocin. It's going to alleviate some of the tension that you're hiding in your body. All those emotions that Robin's speaking of, we are trained very well to hide those inside, sweep them under the rug, don't express them. Well, your body's the rug. So allowing those things to come out and releasing the tension that you're holding in your body is just going to make you a more pleasant person.
That's awesome. Is that why at the end of a massage you do that?
That's to wake you back up.
So Chris is like the best massage therapist ever. And his understanding of physiology, we get into some interesting conversations because he's always dealing with physiology and I'm always dealing with mind, but it's insightful when we... All right. Last one is esteem and efficacy. Accept yourself, stop comparing, accept your mistakes, stop value judging, and affirm yourself. Confidence and esteem is kind of interesting. Esteem has to do more with your sense of worthiness. Like, do you feel like you're a worthy person? Confidence is more about, do I feel like I'm capable of doing this particular thing? And one of the things that I think is interesting is when we compare ourselves to other people, I work a lot with this on teenagers, because as a teenager, their identity is not fully developed. So what they do is they compare themselves to other people, right? I'm not as pretty, I'm not as smart, I'm not as athletic. And they're constantly looking for how they don't actually measure up, versus actually looking at what their natural gifts are. And so that's the easiest way to actually gain confidence. But there's a couple, the one woman was talking about Jane Fonda, which is awesome for a role model. I found a couple of these quotes that I thought was fascinating that'll give you some perspective when you feel like you don't have confidence or you have self-doubt. Jack Canfield, who wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul, do you know how many times he was rejected by publishers? 140. Thomas Edison, who created the light bulb, his teachers told him he was stupid. Walt Disney, I didn't know this one, was fired from his first job. He was told he lacked imagination. J.K. Rowling, rejected from a dozen publishers. Colonel Sanders, rejected 1,009 times. I wonder if he just how'd you count that? Steven Spielberg, rejected 3 times from the School of Theater and Film. Oprah Winfrey, if you look at ACEs, a very abusive childhood. And then Winston Churchill, defeated in every election for public office until he became prime minister at 62. Here's his quote. I'm an optimist. It does not seem too much use being anything else, which kind of summarizes everything else. So one of the things that we can do in building our confidence is recognizing that we have what's called a negativity bias. We're hardwired to identify threats. That's how we perpetuate our survival. So our brain is actually hardwired to look for negative things far more than positive things. And then we identify those negative things and then we fixate on them. And so in order to control some of those thoughts, we have to challenge what some of them are. And a very easy acronym to remember is called ANT, which is an automatic negative thought, which is that thought of like something would go wrong. So detect, identify, challenge, and replace. I was talking to a woman the other day whose son is going into the military. So obviously the emotion she was experiencing was fear. Well, that's a legitimate fear. Like, I can't say, like, oh, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know what will happen. So we had to come up with what she wanted to replace the thought with. The thought was, obviously, he would die. And so I said, what would happen if he died? Would you survive? She said, yeah, would suck. Would you make it through? Yeah. And so I said, have you ever imagined what it's like when he graduates? Like, have you ever envisioned that? And she literally painted a picture of him in uniform with this hat and how nice he looked, and she was at his graduation. And so she used that visual image, and what she told herself is, I'll make it through no matter what, but I'm going to support him. Then she replaced that thought. So every time she felt the ant come in, where it gripped her, like, oh my God, I don't want to lose my son, she could replace it. Now, this takes a lot of work, right? Because we're not always aware of our thoughts, but we can control it if we're aware of it, and actually if we choose to do so. 3-minute breathing space. Another one that, like, if somebody's all worked up and you're like, just calm down, you're liable to get smacked, right? Because that's like the worst thing you could say to somebody. It's like, just relax. But what you can do to calm yourself is shift, and I'm going to mix up the sympathetic from the parasympathetic. But when we're prepared to fight, we're on high alert. And the reason why the digestion is important is because your body doesn't digest unless it's relaxed. And so if you can get your other operating system to go into relaxation mode, you can calm yourself down. And the easiest way to do this is that when you know how people say inhale, count to 6, hold for 6, exhale. The trick is that when you inhale, you need to exhale longer. So when we talked about the fear, how we hold that in, it's very hard, by the way. Like when you're worked up, you want to shallow breathe, and it's hard to like release it for a long time. But it kind of feels like if your body was a bunch of gears where it's like, and it's going like in reverse order, you'll literally feel yourself beginning to calm. And if you practice that enough times, it's one of the easiest ways to calm yourself down. So we're just about out of time. I like to do a wrap-up with what did we learn? What did you guys like? What excited you? Any action items, recognition, rewards, or noteworthy? Let's do one of each very quickly. What did you guys like most? Nice. What excited you most?
Balloons.
Balloons, good. What action steps are you going to take?
Incorporating my
Which one? Many components, good. What can you do to celebrate once you take that action step?
Eat strawberries.
Eat strawberries, that's a good one. I learned something the other day that's one of my favorite things, because we don't often celebrate our achievements. We just create a new goal and then we get focused on that. So if you do something that you're proud of, you don't have to make a big deal about it, but you can say, ta-da! And so I have my clients go, ta-da! And it just feels awesome, and it's so simple. It doesn't cost money. You don't have to go to an expensive restaurant. What's noteworthy? What's the biggest takeaway?
Social support.
Nice. I have a B.O.U.N.C.E workshop where we practice all these skills. If you guys want more information, please see me. I'm happy to share that with you. Leave me your card if you want the slides. And with that, I want to thank you all for spending the afternoon with me. Appreciate it.